video footage from quite possibly three of the best smartphone cameras you're going to see this year. We've got the Huawei Mate 30 Pro, iPhone 11 Pro, as well as the Galaxy Note 10 Plus. And let me know what you think to the audio quality of each of these three devices.
We're off to a pretty good start, kicking things off with the standard wide-angle cameras. All three phones can record 4K video at 60 frames per second. And you can probably tell yourself, in terms of the actual quality, there isn't all that much in it. iPhone has the most natural colors, whilst Huawei and Samsung, they push up the vibrance just that little bit, although this isn't necessarily a disadvantage. What I would say though is that Huawei's dynamic range is not quite as good as the other two. In harsh situations, you'll find that shadows, it doesn't expose them quite as well. We're also going to be scoring these smartphones, one score for every single category, and if you want the full explanation for the scoring system, it's in the description, but long story short, more points equals better. Huawei's Mate 30 Pro has a pretty massive 3x optical zoom, more than the 2x of the other two flagships, and what this translates to is not just being able to get closer to subjects while keeping things sharp, but also Huawei's lens produces some pretty nice cinematic background blur. Now, also with the Huawei Mate 30 Pro, the company's introduced a brand new ultra-wide camera. They call it the cinema camera because of how it's specialized for taking video. But whilst this is going to come in handy later, in most day-to-day scenarios, you're just more likely to notice the fact that it's less wide than the other two, as opposed to it actually recording anything in higher quality. Also, the iPhone is the master of consistency here. Between its three lenses, the color profile remains pretty much unchanged, whereas on ultra-wide, Huawei and Samsung really punch up the contrast. On a bit of a side note, I'm also launching a massive iPhone 11 giveaway with Philip from Everything Apple Pro. All the info for that is going to be in the description below. Anyways, both Huawei and Samsung can also do portrait mode video, although as an effect, I personally don't think this is reliable enough to be something I'd actually use, but in terms of which one does it better, it's Huawei. The Galaxy Note 10 also has audio zoom, the ability to zoom into an object and hear directional audio from whatever is in frame. It's done well, but not hugely important in the scheme of things. Stabilization is something I've been itching to test ever since I first saw the Mate 30 Pro, but one thing to clarify, when you're shooting standard one-time zoom video, we're not actually using the new cinema camera because that's an ultra-wide, but even then the stabilization is absolutely fantastic on all three. If we scale this resolution down to 1080p, then stabilization only improves across the board. Each of these devices has its own super steady feature, and they work. Also, in this test, I'm adding a new category, ultra-wide stabilization, as I'm just starting to see more and more of this camera being used for video. So actually, none of these cameras have OIS, but part of me was expecting Huawei's to come out on top, considering that this new cinema camera was exactly for this scenario, but to be honest, they're all really good. Thankfully, Huawei's slow motion is outstanding. In all aspects, it's been given a huge leg up from past generations. So that means it can now record continuous slow motion at a higher quality than before, higher than both other phones, but also, it has the ability to capture 7,680 frame per second slow-mo. I've got a lot of thoughts on this. It's so slow it practically stops time in its tracks, completely unprecedented on a phone. But there are a few caveats. First of all, if you look closely, you can see that the subjects that are moving, they're not sharp in every frame, which means that Huawei's using software to fill in extra frames. Plus, it is so slow that you'll have to time your slow-mo impeccably to not miss what you were trying to capture. iPhone is the only camera that can also take slow-mo on the front camera, or as they like to call it, the slow-fi. The quality is good, all things considered, but I think you're much less likely to want to slow-mo yourself than whatever's happening in front of you. Now for the big one, and in fact the category I've placed the most weight on. Daytime or reasonably well lit photos, because that is the majority of what people use their cameras for. Long story short, there isn't much in it. Each phone has its own style, its own colors, its own sharpness levels, but they are all great. Even actually, if we crop into this shot 20 times, you can see detail is pretty much identical. The main difference just being that Samsung uses a stronger noise reduction algorithm, which makes images a little softer but have less grain. You can switch the Huawei to taking 40 megapixel shots, but generally this isn't a lot better and restricts what you can do with the camera. The iPhone 11 Pro has a very slight edge when coping with difficult dynamic range scenarios, but yeah, very close. If you were wanting to capture objects that are further away, then you probably guessed it, Huawei is going to be better. It's just got more optical zoom, there's not actually a lot to it. This is another one of those examples though, where you can see how well the iPhone retains its color consistency. As we go here from 2x to 10x, Huawei and Samsung, they both completely shift the way the image actually looks. The story with ultrawides is not as straightforward. If we crop into the ultrawide shots, then you can see that this new cine camera on the Huawei is marginally better than the other two. But it comes at the cost of range. The field of view is so much smaller on the Huawei, and whilst this does mean a little bit less distortion, it also means that I think the shots are just a lot less dramatic. That said, macro shots on the Huawei are fantastic. Combining a close focusing distance with a wide aperture is a recipe for tasty looking natural background blur. And speaking of background blur, portrait mode. iPhones have always won this category, and I don't think that's changed here. Apple's effect is generally subtler, but that often works better. This picture is a good example of what I mean. Apple's colours are warmer and more natural looking, and if we crop into my face, you can see that whilst it has missed the mark a little with edge detection, it's done the more